Hello and welcome to Oregon's 2021 Virtual Poetry Out Loud Contest. My name is Deb Vaughn, my pronouns are she, her, and I am the Education Coordinator at the Oregon Arts Commission. This is my 13th year working on Poetry Out Loud. I am a white woman in my 40s with dark curly hair. Behind me is a window with closed blinds and a wooden silhouette of the state of Oregon. Before we begin and introduce our panelists, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the many tribes and bands who call Oregon their ancestral territory, and to honor the ongoing relationship between the land, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place that we now call Oregon. We recognize the sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes who have ties to this place, and we thank them for continuing to teach us how we might all be here together. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Brianna Linden, and she will introduce us to the panelists.
Hi there, my name is Brianna Linden. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns. I am a white woman with long blonde hair wearing a black and cream colored shirt with hearts on it. I have a bookshelf and some artwork behind me. I have been helping to coordinate the Poetry Out Loud contest for the last few years. I'm an artist and an educator, and I'm really happy to be here today with these fabulous people that we have with us. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about them, and then we're going to launch into a conversation. Just wanted to take a quick moment to remind you that this is being recorded. Let's see. Jillian, would you start us off today and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Of course. So my name is Jillian Frakes. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a 10th and 11th grade English teacher here locally in Southern Oregon. My connection to Poetry Out Loud is that I competed as a student in high school myself, and I was the 2012 Oregon State Champion. I've judged for the organization in the past, and now that I'm a teacher, I've been able to incorporate it into my curriculum. I'm a white woman in my 20s with brown hair and green glasses. Behind me, there's a brown dresser and a green wall, and I use she, her pronouns.
I was the first one to talk without unmuting, yay. I'm Juan Antonio Trujillo, and I'm a past Poetry Out Loud judge a couple of times, and I'm recently retired from teaching language and teacher education, cultural studies at Oregon State University. I am a bald, middle-aged, light-skinned Latino man who uses he, him pronouns, and él if I'm speaking Spanish. I'm wearing a blue plaid flannel shirt, and there are plants and a Super 8 projector in the frame with me.
Hello, my name is MOsley WOtta. I am an artist and performer in Central Oregon. I use he, him pronouns. I'm brown because my mom is blonde and my dad is black. And I'm wearing a James Baldwin t-shirt. Behind me is a sculpture of my brown dad. In front of me is a picture of my grandmother holding a cigarette, sticking her tongue out. I'm a Poetry Out Loud advocate.
And I'm Steph Imig, and I am a teacher with Oregon Charter Academy. So I've been teaching in the online environment for over a decade now. I've been with Poetry Out Loud as a coordinator for, I think, 6 years. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a white woman in my 40s with short, light brown hair. Behind me are photos of one of my old cats and a door to my backyard.
Thank you so much, all of you. Welcome, and thank you for being with us today as we talk a little bit about coaching Poetry Out Loud in this kind of unique time that we're in now. And in fact, we'd love to dive right into that, Steph. With your experience working with Poetry Out Loud for years and working in virtual environments, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some tips for teaching Poetry Out Loud in a virtual environment.
Yeah, well, I think you actually gave a perfect segue when you mentioned coaching, and that I also have extensive experience in the coaching world with sports, and I feel like I pull on that experience the most when it comes to poetry out loud. That I've approached it as a coach rather than what am I going to do in a classroom, but instead it's always been about recruiting individual students who I know this could be magic for. Reluctant students, some come like bashing through the virtual walls. They just can't wait to be involved. But others, it's like, I just know it's the right thing for them. And I just really want to share the experience with them. So it's like personal invitation, personal recruitment. I tell my co-teachers to do the same thing. And so it's been like, individual student by individual student that we bring together in a club that meets outside of classes. So there's and then I facilitate and coach there. So it's really about having teachers who will target specific students. Like we put out the general announcements, but that's never really where the students come from. The students come ultimately after the general announcements from teachers saying, I think you should check this out. And so really just approaching it on that individual level and having that sort of space, that club, that virtual meeting set up where the students get weekly coaching. And it's just been an individual enterprise. And it's never been huge, and usually the attrition is pretty significant because once students realize how hard it is, they don't always stay. But then the ones who do get the greatest gift of all. And I pull their testimonies year after year to share with new students because again and again, you hear the like, I wanted to quit. I was so scared and I did it and it changed my life, And so I have those student stories that I share also. So just really coming at it individually. And if I'm working with 6 students, I'm working with 6 students. And I know that for those 6 students, it changes their lives. And I've really come to sort of be okay with that. Of course, I would like more, but I know what it does for those students.
Thank you so much. There's so much in that. I was listening to you talk about that idea of perseverance. Those kids that they have to kind of get over this, like, oh my God, this is really hard to get to the good stuff that is available to them there, which kind of leads me into my next question about how to generate enthusiasm for poetry with students. Like what's important to Juan or MOsley as poets, as teachers? Is there anything that you've landed on or discovered to help students get excited and sort of generate enthusiasm for poetry?
Sure, I guess I could start a little bit with this. Well, and this is really something that's true. I mean, speaking kind of a little bit from my teacher educator corner at this point, one of the things that really is critical in good educational practice is making connections between disciplinary subjects and students' lives. And I have found that poetry can actually be an exceptional way to make those kinds of connections. And although, I can't say that all poetry is capable of kind of reaching people on an emotional level, of speaking to passions. There is some poetry, some particularly historic epic poetry that maybe doesn't hit that at all. There is a huge body of poetry out there that really can draw people in and help the students really kind of see that literature is really not just a dry, dead subject, but something that has a lot of relevance. And in order to generate enthusiasm, I think the point really is to give the students the freedom to actually find their passion through poetry. And so being able to direct the students to a lot of different sources, maybe not the ones that you as a teacher might be inclined to look at for yourself, but to kind of guide the students to different places where they can find poetry that speaks to them, I think that that's probably key.
I think that's what Juan was just saying. That is like a huge component of it, because you want the students to be able to recognize some aspect that is true to them in the work that you're presenting, and finding that within the tried and true literature that's been, you know, in the curriculum for years, and then also stuff that is well outside of that but is still widely respected globally is really important. And then seeing that also in maybe more abstract ways that students can connect to, but just in their natural surroundings. So like even finding garbage that has little lines on it or something that is in the gutter, whatever, where they can see like, oh, there's thought and there's poetry within this thing that's been discarded. And then the metaphor of that, like, oh, what other places have I been sort of kicked to the curb, but I have value if somebody would just look, or like water coming out of a gutter and the rhythm that might make, and then what that might inspire, like that stuff. I also think Juan was touching on this as well and saying it as well, but the building trust part, to create this connection with the students, that you have to run the same sort of trial by fire that they're going through. And so it's been really, I've noticed classes where like I hang way back, or experiences where I hang way back and like push them to the forefront without initiating myself in like the performance part. And so it's really important to get rid of the pedestals that come with poetry and just be like, we're in a peer group here. I know I'm older than you and I have these other experiences, but we all are able to come to it in a really genuine way if we're all having to get up and risk that sort of vulnerability. And then we have a shared experience that's unique to that group. That's big.
I hear you guys talking about making connections to students' lives, something that's authentic to them, true to them, maybe even something that goes outside of something that feels where you might go, but being open to all kinds of different kinds of possibilities. I wonder, for any of you really, where you see, I mean, I think it's so hard sometimes for us to figure out where we might go if we haven't gone there already. What kinds of opportunities, what kinds of challenges have you seen? What kinds of opportunities have you seen? How have you as an educator created strategies for discovering things that might feel authentic to students? Where do you find that? How do you go there? Does that question make sense? How do you as an educator kind of get your mind around that to be able to be true to students? Do you see where I'm going? Anybody? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that, and it actually is, it's not that you planted it for Poetry Out Loud, but specifically since I'm doing Poetry Out Loud in both of my 11th and 12th grade classes right now, the Poetry Out Loud anthology has been so perfect to let them, they hear we're doing poetry for 2 weeks, and the first thing they're like, oh God. And then we just spend time and we just go through and look at all the different types of things. And I just let them be surprised. Like what surprises you? What didn't you expect? And then their project is really about like finding what's theirs there. And one of my classes is really around the theme of windows and mirrors, and another is around power of language. And so both of those are just like such perfect links into Poetry Out Loud. And so really, I mean, the anthology on Poetry Out Loud is such a gift because it's so easy to navigate, and students are so quickly surprised that like, oh, I'm not just reading John Donne. I mean, you can, but then, and it's really fun, like watching them go through that journey.
So I'll also jump in here. I find that what I try to stress to students matches up really perfectly with what Steph, you were just saying. I encourage them to find a poem that they have some sort of emotional reaction to. And for some who are resistant or just hesitant, it may not necessarily be a positive emotional reaction. It might be something that gets under their skin or makes them kind of question their own experiences or the world around them. And that's fantastic. I think it's really important that students are able to use the poems that are available in the anthology. And there's such a great wealth of them, both to help them express their own voices, to find a way to put words to some of the emotions that they might not be able to at 14 or 15 fully express themselves. But it's also a really great opportunity for them to connect with the voices and experiences of people who are different to them, have had different experiences, have had the same experiences, but in a different way. So when I take them through the annotation process, which is really important to me, and I focus a lot on that, I encourage them to annotate and look for literary devices and so forth. But first and foremost, to have a conversation with the poem and to recognize that there's a person behind the words that you're talking back to or alongside that person. That the student's own voice is valid, that they don't have to agree with everything just because it's printed, but that they also have to recognize that it's not just words that I printed on a paper and put in front of them, that it's something a little more active to engage with.
One thing that I just want to add a little bit, I'm a person who comes from a kind of complex intersectional background. And as someone who identifies as queer, who identifies as Latino, it's easy for me to see that there are some segments of the student population that are predictably left out when it comes to finding material that's relevant. So I think one of the things, it certainly isn't something that can be handled in checkbox fashion, but I think that it's important for educators to be aware of which groups have been systematically minoritized, marginalized, and make sure that those are some poetry options, those are some experiences that are laid out explicitly on the table.
Juan, that is a lovely connection to something that Brianna and I were talking about that we wanted to address in this webinar, and that was a question about students seeking poems in the Poetry Out Loud anthology by poets that had some of the same racial demographics or, that aligned with their own experience. And while that official anthology has not been checkboxed, partly because it covers poets throughout history. And so unless someone has self-identified, I think the NEA is cautious about assigning an identity to them. What I can say is that the NEA has done a huge amount of work adding additional poems to the anthology by poets who do self-identify outside of kind of a white, cis, hetero demographic. So a couple of the different ways that students can find and seek poetry that might not readily appear in their standard curriculum, they can search by time period of the poet. And so if they want a very historic, if they want John Donne, they can isolate that time period. But they can also focus on more contemporary poets who are writing between 1950 and present day. And there are a lot of currently living and writing poets included in the anthology. They can also search by theme, which is another way that they can get at identity, because there are poems that are identified in the anthology as addressing identities. And so that's another way. They can also look for literary devices. Jillian, you were mentioning that you encourage students to do that analysis. So if they find that alliteration is something that is really appealing to them, they can pull poems that use that device regularly. So there's a couple of different ways, in addition to teacher guidance and Googling, that students can hopefully find a connection to poems that speak to them from where they are. The other opportunity that I just want to take a moment to share that is unique to this year, and we don't know whether we're going to be able to continue it or not, but because of where we are, student voice has come up already in this conversation. And one of the ways that we wanted to honor student voice in this very unique time is to offer school champions the opportunity to submit their own original works to an anthology that we'll be producing. So at the national level, this opportunity has been available to state champions for the last several years. So we're trying to replicate that a little bit. It's not a competition, it's a showcase. And so for those students who are nominated as their school champion, we'll send them the information. We're calling it Oregon Ourselves. And those students can submit their own original work. So we hope that's an opportunity for students to share even more of their own voice, their own perspective, and their own reflections on their experiences.
Thank you so much for that, Deb. There are a lot of things that are kind of unique about this year. I wondered from any of you if you have any thinking about teachers out there that are watching this to try to get a sense of how to connect poetry to poetry out loud or just poetry in general. Are there any tips or tools that you have used to connect with poetry right now in this sort of virtual world that we live in?
Or that you would recommend that people consider, right? And maybe you haven't had the opportunity yet, but it's something you've been noodling on.
I don't know if we're pausing because we're being thoughtful is got to be part of it, but then also I think polite. Like I think there's just a general sort of like respectful, like, no, you go kind of thing that must be happening because there's a lot. Well, like one thing that happened, I think that maybe it's a bit odd to admit as a writer, and maybe the stereotype or the inherent nature of being a writer means you have to like cloister yourself into some weird little spot and you appear to be by yourself, but you're actually with like a lot of different entities. Folks were like, you can't go out and you have to be like locked down, shut down. And with everything else that was included in the potential nightmare of that, there was also a seed of like, sweet, like now's time for the book. And I think there's something in that, like now's the time to like write. Now's the time to get after the things that requires that solitude and that cloistered demand. The thing that I got out of that maybe was a leaning into what is actually going on. And not that we have to pretend that this is a silver lining, but there was a kind of honesty that there was a kind of admitting of what was happening. And that is a very freeing place to be. There's a level of honesty just being able to see into each other's homes through this Zoom platform or whatever. There's a level of authenticity with your life and kids and whatever you have going on, roommates or whatever you have going on around you. All of those things are different. There's a paradigm shift where I can no longer just see my teacher as a function of my getting the grade to go on to the next thing. Like there's this idea that the teacher just, when you leave, the teacher just goes under the desk and then like waits for you to come back in the classroom and then come back out from the desk. So everything got like a little bit more real, a little bit more authentic, a little bit more vulnerable. And I think, again, I'm really interested in how we sort of level the dynamic playing field where teachers are in the same soup as the students. And to some degree, that can bring us a lot closer together. And poetry is a really fantastic place where you can talk about all these complex and abstract things and have them make coherent personal sense, right? And so this is like an offering during this time to lean into what's happening, which was cool.
Thank you so much for that. I feel that on so many levels. I'm curious, looking at especially the educators here that are currently teaching kids, you know, every day or all week long. I think that when we entered this, for myself, I had ideas about how to do this. And as I've gone along, that's really evolved. Is there anything that you've learned about working with students as we've continued to be in a virtual environment? Steph, you've already been in this. I'm kind of curious about, is it different now than it was for you last year? Because this is a mode that you've been teaching in for years. But I think the fact that we're all doing this across the globe may change things. I'm curious about that. I'm curious about anything that you've learned about, to me, poetry is so much about connecting to something. And so how do we do this with this in this sort of screen environment. I think that MOsley's absolutely right. In some ways, I think there may be ways that it brings something up that's really authentic, and there may also be barriers. And I'm wondering how you've navigated that and what it looks like for you with students.
Gosh, there's a lot in that question. So I'll see if I can kind of pare it down. I think that certainly this year, this school year has been different for me as well, even though I've been in online education. A lot has changed with my school. And so my school looks really different this year. And so my students have a really different experience this year, and then the world in general. And so there's not a lot that's been the same. And yes, trying to just embrace all that is different and new and roll with it. And there is a lot of opportunity in it as well. And I know that's kind of vague, but it's hard for me to speak as like a super experienced person in this context when I've been navigating a lot of really new contexts as well. But that said, I would say that poetry, I appreciate it so much in the virtual environment, and I always have, but even more so this year, because I continue to find that sustaining students' energy for longer readings is really challenging when you don't have them in your presence. And so so shorter readings that provide just as much richness and complexity they're far more functional in the online environment. And so poetry is just like perfect. It gives us that common language. It gives us that common ground. It gives us that shared experience, like MOsley was saying. And like, how much do we need that right now? So it's not only super functional and utilitarian in the online environment, it's like what we crave too. It's like this desperate need at the same time. So I feel like it operates on so many levels. And I just keep coming back to it that like poetry is the key in so many ways that can help answer so many issues in the educational setting. So I use it. I mean, I come back to it practically daily with my students in some form.
One of the things that reminds me of is a couple of years ago, and I can't remember if it was even you that said it, Jillian, but one of our state contestants one year, we were talking to them about why is poetry out loud important, or what did you learn from it? And whichever young person it was said, in my day-to-day life growing up and navigating the world, I struggle to find words to express what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling. And the words of other poets allow me to speak and say what my truth is with confidence. And I don't have that on my own. And I thought that was such a beautiful testimony to why there is value in taking another writer's words into your own body and sharing them, as opposed to only your own words, because sometimes your own words don't come as easily.
I love that so much. It makes me start thinking then about students this year and what it's going to be like for them submitting poems via video. That's how we'll be viewing all of our poems this year. Thinking all of you have had experience with poetry out loud and with reciting poetry. Jillian, I'd love if you could kind of start off, if you have any advice about what teachers could be thinking about in terms of coaching students right now. Any tips that you might have about coaching for strong performances?
Right. I'm a little hesitant to speak about like curriculum specific things since I'm unfortunately on a leave of absence this year. But coaching, like Steph said, is something connected to but separate from classroom teaching. Advice I would give to teachers. Let me see. I wrote notes. I was prepared. Encourage students to find a poem that resonates with them. Give them total free rein. In the past, there have been, depending on your school, there may have been some, different encouragements or restrictions on poem choice, but let them do whatever they want, what speaks to their soul. I also have students do a lot of time, spend a lot of time beforehand on annotation, but not, like I said, not just picking out metaphors, right? Writing down their reactions to the poem and their experiences, because that annotation, if you do that close reading work, it leads really easily into recitation. If you've marked that this stanza makes you feel sad or makes you feel contemplative, okay, then how are you going to convey that with your voice and your affect, right? So what I have students do when I'm with them in the classroom, not this year, but hopefully soon, I have them go through and mark the most important line in the poem to them. It's not always the true thesis, I guess, of the poem, but it's one that they connect to. And I start by saying one line, but I always have kids who are like, my poem's 2 pages long, there's got to be more than one, right? So then I would have them pick out more until hopefully eventually you could go line by line and say what's important in each line, right? But I ask them, with this important line, how are you going to stress it? Are you going to change your speed, your volume? Are you going to pause before, after, in the middle of the line? Are you going to include a gesture? And then I have them kind of repeat that process through the rest of the body of the poem. If you have that annotation ahead of time, sometimes it makes it easier for them to have their own thoughts and channel them into a performance. Also, it's kind of a simple thing, but the most important thing I think you can do as a teacher or a coach is to show your own enthusiasm for poetry. Life is really difficult right now, and I don't have a lot of enthusiasm about many things, but poetry I do. So just to share with them your own joy in the language is both a really nice type of modeling, but it's also something that allows you to connect with them at a deeper level.
That's great. Thank you so much. Any other thoughts from folks about coaching students for performance? You all have your own way that this is such a deep part of the work that you do. You don't have to be polite. You can just jump right in.
I think I would just add 2 things onto what Jillian said, because that was all incredible advice. And I would say, specifically when I'm coaching students, one of the things that is most helpful to them, where I see their recitations change the most dramatically, is when I force them to recite the poem in really different ways. So to punch different words and have them listen to it read totally different ways. And I have them record themselves doing that so that they can hear it. And then that process of deciding what works, how it changed, that tends to be a moment for them where their recitation moves to a new level. So I've found that to be a really transformative moment for them, an activity. And then the other thing that I've found really important this year when I'm working with all of my students, those who aren't necessarily choosing to participate in Poetry Out Loud, but who I'm taking through the learning and the process, is using the color wheel of emotions as a way to identify tone in the poem, and also using the color wheel of emotions as as a check-in at the beginning of class, so that they're thinking about themselves and the poem in the same language, and that it tends to become an exercise in empathy. And again, it's like, that's what we need right now. So just looking for those moments where it's like, I'm using the poetry as a vehicle towards something else, and a way for engaging the students, that's not about reciting a poem for Poetry Out Loud. And that's just been really transformative for my students in class. So I would just offer that up as well.
Steph, as a
Thank
former theater educator myself, one of the other suggestions to add to your read it with a different vocal inflection is to move with it. So finding at the end of you can do it where you walk across the room at the end of each line to really get the line breaks, but then you can mix that up and say, okay, in the middle of each line, you have to walk to the other side of the room. And sometimes just getting your body, you know, in Poetry Out Loud, we ask students to stay stationary. So it's easy from the beginning, I think, just to get really stuck physically. And so encouraging students, because they're moving in a space that's their own, as opposed to a classroom and maybe they're constrained by desks or whatever, they can go outside, they can move in the backyard, and they can really find some energy in their bodies, which I think is also really necessary as we spend so much time on our devices. Jillian, you were gonna chime in.
I was just going to say thank you. This is great. I'm taking curriculum notes for next year.
MOsley or Juan, great. Go ahead, MOsley.
Well, I was just going to say I saw Juan on mute, actually.
Yeah, but I'm willing to wait my turn too. I can be polite too. Well, the only thing I was going to say is I feel like I'm speaking out of turn a little bit when it comes to coaching, because that's not the context in which I work with poetry. My teaching experience was all at the university level, and there isn't at this point a Poetry Out Loud equivalent at that level. But what I do want to say is that my most meaningful experiences with poetry in the classroom setting have involved really, I guess what I'm trying to say, it's important in a coaching or mentoring environment of any sort to not put the entire burden of the experience that's taking place in that space on the learner. And I'm, you know, in my teacher education courses and in the classes that I taught, I've always been really explicit, even from the wording of my syllabus, to, you know, kind of deconstruct the traditional relationship between teacher and student. I have always tried to go in and flatten the power structure as much as possible. And I refer to us all collectively as learners in those documents. And I try to keep that attitude in the space. And so if I am not willing to be performative with poetry in the way that I'm asking the students to be performative with poetry, it's just not going to work. So, you know, that's the only thing that I would like to add. If I, as a teacher, as a co-learner in that space, am not willing to go there, I can't ask that of them either.
MOsley, it's you. Did you have something to add?
I mean, I agree with what is being said here. I literally was just unmuting to say I saw Juan unmute. That's really all that it was. I do have a technical thing that somebody has told me that was helpful, which goes into the other ways to interpret the poem. But like, you know, reading it backwards and figuring out, like, if you literally want to try to read it backwards, there's a variety of ways in which you can do that. But you usually end up discovering something else. Then the metaphor of that is sort of reading the inverse or the opposite or the opposing view. And I think there's something really interesting about exploring those things as well, the things that you disagree with, especially right now when we keep being told we're so divided. I don't necessarily know if I believe that, but I am told that a lot. So it's always an interesting way to explore what is the perceived other, I guess.
Thank you all so much. This is, I hope that teachers who are watching this are inspired and encouraged. And I would guess that a lot of our seasoned Poetry Out Loud teachers have their own suggestions and ideas about how to best encourage students in this work. So it's making me think that maybe this is an opportunity that we should create for dialogue on an ongoing basis in other years too. So thank you all for that inspiration. I want to open it up if there are any questions from attendees. I think that we do have a few, and there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And if you don't see that, you can use the chat feature. That will work as well. So we're happy to address either these kind of broader questions about encouraging and coaching and supporting students, and also Brianna and I are here and we can address technical questions about how can we adopt this program this year, what are the requirements, what are the dates. So let me know. It looks like we do have a question that's come in from an attendee, a technical one, which is great. When engaging in the classroom level contest, can the definition of classroom be interpreted broadly? Yes, the answer to that is absolutely yes, especially this year where students are interacting with each other and with teachers really differently. Even Steph mentioned that often Poetry Out Loud is run as an extracurricular outside of class opportunity at her school. And that would count as a classroom of teachers, that cohort that she's coached and curated would count as a classroom. So that would be absolutely fine. And Poetry Out Loud isn't mandatory. So it can absolutely be a abbreviated cohort of students who, well, I know I saw MOsley say, darn it, that it's not mandatory. There are some states where their Department of Education has made it a strongly encouraged part of the curriculum, so that is possible. But yeah, work with the willing is my recommendation, and particularly given where everybody is at this year, that we're not needing to put additional requirements on top of students. And Poetry Club, combining from other sources, highly adaptable. To be clear, really the minimum requirement from our perspective to move on to the regional level is that at least 2 students have presented poems and been adjudicated by neutral judges using the Poetry Out Loud criteria, and that one of them has a higher score than the other. So that's, bare minimum baseline. We are happy to accept students at the regional level as long as they have gone through that threshold. So thank you for the question. Let's see, I think we talked about Oregon ourselves. I wanted to make sure to mention that. Smallest number of possible students, we wanted to address that. And in the chat box, thank you, Brianna has put the link to register for Poetry Out Loud this year. We have until this Friday, which is the 15th of January. So I think as we, certainly there's space for other questions, but as we move towards the end of this conversation, I just wanted to put one last question out to our panelists, and if you're compelled to respond, we appreciate it. But why should teachers even attempt Poetry Out Loud this year with everything else that is going on? I think you touched on it a bit in some of your remarks, but if you were going to sum up and a teacher came to you and said, I don't know, Jillian, you said I should do this program, but why? Would you each be willing to take a shot at responding to that?
Well, I can go ahead and start. My response to a student would be a little different than my response to a teacher. But if I'm talking to other teachers, my response is that you need this as much as the students do. That some of the most soul-filling interactions I've had with students over the last few weeks have come from my students working on Poetry Out Loud. And we need that. We need the things that are going to keep fueling us and help us to have the energy to tackle the things that are much, less positive in some ways. But the feedback that I get from my students in Poetry Out Loud, sort of on a purely selfish level, gives me energy to embrace my job. So it's worth every moment. So that's what I would say for teachers.
Okay, I'm going to be rude and not wait. I agree. I don't know that there's much more to add to what Steph summed up so trenchantly, but I would say it's really important always for students to develop confidence in their own voice to work to develop empathy within themselves. But it's obviously especially important now. So just on a purely skill-based level, Poetry Out Loud is fantastic for students and teachers alike. But also in a year that has been so devastating for so many people, I think it's important to celebrate what we still can, with respect for what's happened that's negative, but also to remember that even in a time that's difficult, there are still small bright spots, and that poetry can be some of those.
And my thoughts really kind of similar. I don't know that there is any other literary genre, or really very many other disciplines that appear in our classroom, that have a greater capacity to present distillations of human experience. And there is so much going on. I think having this as a tool to process so much of what's going on, to be able to see the resonance of these same feelings and challenges throughout all humanity, throughout all times, throughout all regions of the world, throughout all these different, I think that we'd certainly be really limiting ourselves in a terrible way if we don't keep poetry as part of what happens in our interactions with students.
Yeah, it grants you permission to articulate the full spectrum of the sentient experience. And that's a nice thing to note, that it doesn't all have to be one way or the other. This is opportunity for that.
Beautiful. Thank you all for that reflection. And I just want to make an offer to any of the teachers that are watching this to let you know that if you are grappling with how to modify or adapt Poetry Out Loud for your students this year, or if you're watching this in the future, in a future year, that Brianna and I are available to talk that through with you. We can help make sure that you're meeting the requirements, but also help you brainstorm ways that you can take your students beyond that if that's what you want to do. So if you're not sure if this is going to work for you this year, give us a call, because we'd like to help you see a way to bring this opportunity to your students. And with that, I would like to turn it over to MOsley WOtta, who we have invited to offer some closing words and show us that power of poetry together.
Okie doke. So I had a lot of things I wanted to say, but I'm going to do this in a way that any grandmother of mine would be like, yeah, that's okay. You didn't cuss. I like rappers. I like kids who rap. I like folks who take like the very basic skill set of rhyming that we learned at a very young age and mess with it and play with it. This leans into a lot of what I think has been important for me personally, or what I'm drawn to navigating the waters of difference. That when I remember some science class in middle school or whatever, somebody saying like energy is not created or destroyed, like, and somebody else saying that it, some chunk of energy or whatever goes bouncing throughout every spot in the universe, and it made me think about how one of our challenges as a species, as far as human beings go, and one thing that poetry provides, is seeing this as that, right? And so this whole idea of at some point, I literally believe that at some point I will be you if I haven't already been, and that at some point, if you have not already been, you will be me. So that's what this speaks to. That and fiery bars. Okay, now let's hope I don't mess it up, or let's hope I do, and then let's see what happens. That would be a more authentic experience, probably. Let's see. We legitimate hypocrites under Hippocratic oath, using melody's medicine, supping epiphany's yoke, crack the shell back in reverence to converse with the ghosts. There's no telling what evidence, but I know what I know, that every soul intelligence sows a seed that influences our navigational systems to interpret the nuances and indication. Oh shoot. Anyway, let me skip. Sorry. If we are just energy, it's good to have a mess up. That was a legit mess up. If we are just energy, that's our system and fate, bound to travel eternity once we're let out the gate. Don't it then stand to reason that someday we trade place, and I would argue the other side of the same damn debate? When I look in the mirror, all I see is your fate. Set. Please make more mistakes more often, and then own them.
Thank you all for being here, for being part of this conversation. Shout out to our interpreters who just rolled with that whole thing, including that incredible poem at the end. Appreciate you so much for being here, and for this wonderful conversation. Thanks for helping our teachers get their minds around poetry out loud in the 2021 school year.